everybody, my name is Cory Dillinger. I'm an associate here at MPL. Been an associate for about 4.5 years, and my practice area specializes primarily in renewable energy development and land use. Today, I want to talk about 5 tips to increase your chances when developing solar projects in Pennsylvania. First tip, and it sounds pretty general, but it's generally understanding your zoning pathway. What that means is there's a couple different items to get into. First is whether or not your approval is at the local municipality level or at the county level. And sometimes that process can be bifurcated. Sometimes you'll be getting zoning approvals at a local municipal level, then you'll be getting your subdivision and land development approvals at the county level. So just understanding that process earlier on is definitely better and may streamline the process for developers. A second part of that, that kind of ties into where those approvals are, is what the applicable ordinances are, whether that be a standalone solar ordinance at the municipal level, whether that be an applicable underlining zoning ordinance, or whether those ordinances are at the county level. Sometimes it can be very straightforward, but when you get into more rural parts of the state, you'd be surprised how long it takes to understand, okay, what's my pathway here and what are the applicable ordinances. So just to get all that in line earlier in the process is definitely a best practice. Second, when looking at those ordinances, I would say understanding not only what is required in those ordinances, but also what may be expected. And what I mean by that is, typically there is what I consider explicit ordinance requirements and implicit ordinance requirements. Explicit ordinance requirements are easy. The ordinance says you need X, Y, Z. You should be prepared to put on evidence and potentially testimony to show X, Y, Z. Where it gets a little bit trickier is these implicit requirements. And what I mean by that is, some solar ordinances across the state might talk about glare, but might not explicitly say that a glare study is required. In those instances when glare is mentioned, it's typically a best practice to prepare a glare study and have that ready. Where it gets even a little bit more murkier will be if there's any kind of general standards about the public safety, health, and welfare. If there's a big catch-all provision like that, it's kind of on the developer and the various consultants to make your best guess of, okay, well, what materials and what testimony do we need to put on to show that we can meet that catch-all. Obviously, you can't produce all of the evidence under the sun to show that your project doesn't negatively impact public safety, health, and welfare, but you do want to do your best job to meet that catch-all provision. Number 3, be at least somewhat familiar with the previous approvals or denials in that municipality. A lot of times these decisions may be public. Sometimes you may just want to ask, the municipality manager or something like that. It's less important with approvals, although if there are approvals, you should be familiar with maybe some of the conditions that are put on those approvals. But I would say it is crucial if there are denials. You want to know why that project was denied, and you want to figure out how you can differentiate your project from that denial. Number 4 is understanding the developer's burden. This is a mix of zoning analysis and also a little bit of case law research. It's typical in Pennsylvania for the developer or the applicant to have the burden to meet all of the ordinance's objective criteria. Once that is done, the burden then shifts to objectors to show that the project would negatively impact public safety, health, and welfare, more than your average solar project. That's typically what the burden is. Sometimes there is burden shifting, and recent Pennsylvania case law says that burden shifting is allowed. Sometimes that burden will be shifted that not only that the applicant has to show that they meet the objective criteria, but they also may need to show that they meet some of that subjective criteria. So just understand that going in and know when the developer can be kind of safe resting their case or whether you need to put more on. And then last, but certainly not least, is more just specific issues that we come across in ordinances. Things such as internal lot lines A developer might have two really good parcels of land, but they are actually separate. And depending on the language of the ordinance, you might not be able to just waive those internal setbacks. So maybe you need to look at something like a reverse subdivision or something like that. Another very common ordinance issue, we're seeing a lot of agricultural soil limitations across the state. The language varies across the state, but in a nutshell, it just says you can only develop on X amount of prime agricultural soils. So just doing those calculations early on will let you know if your project can happen or not, or if you may need relief from those sections. The two other ones that I feel like can cause issues is also just understanding your general setbacks. What I mean by that is, it's easy to know that, okay, I have 100-foot setbacks, but knowing, okay, is that from an occupied residential building? Is that from any adjacent property line? Just understand that early on so you're not assuming that you're working with less constraints than you actually are. And then finally, impervious lot coverage. Pennsylvania DEP has a solar FAQ that does say that the area underneath the panels, so long as you meet various criteria, should not be considered impervious lot coverage. But that doesn't mean local municipalities won't make their ordinances say the exact opposite, and that the area of the panels will be considered impervious lot coverage. Just make sure to analyze that, because depending on the size of the project and the other constraints the developer is working with, that can certainly be a tough provision to deal with. So those are the 5 tips. If anyone has any questions about renewable energy development or land use, please don't hesitate to reach out to anyone here at MPL that does that work. Thanks.